Welcome to Syntax, a Generative Introduction, 4th edition. My name is Andrew Carnie. I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona. I'm the author of your textbook, and I'll be leading you through this series of video tutorials. In this video, we're going to talk about a controversy. And that controversy is how we figure out what the meaning of an ellipted or elided VP is in VP ellipsis and in also the phenomenon known as sluicing. This is an open controversy. There's still a lot of debate about this. And I will show you data that argues for two different hypotheses. I'll show you data that argues for one hypothesis known as Pf deletion, where you delete the VP at the PF or phonetic form level. The alternative analysis is one that's called LF copying, where what we do is we recover the meaning of the ellipted verb phrase or TP by virtue of copying the information in from the antecedent. So we actually won't have a definitive answer to the question that you're seeing on the screen right now. How do we recover the meaning of ellipsis? We actually will see that there's evidence for two different ways to do it. And we'll have to think carefully about what that means for our theories of grammar. So let us first compare the two hypotheses. So one idea about how things like anaphors and pronouns get their meaning at the level of LF, the level of semantic interaction, is that what the co-indexing does is it effectively makes a copy. So the sentence Frank loves himself means Frank loves Frank. So what you do is you take, because of this index, what you do is you take the other thing that's indexed with it and copy it in. Now, before you say this is a principle C violation, you would be right, but principle C doesn't hold at LF. That's the basic intuition, that once you do this copying element, the binding conditions have already been met. But this is how you figure out who himself refers to, is the indexing is effectively a copying operation. So there's a copying rule. This happens both with anaphors and with pronouns. So Frank thinks he might have insulted Morgan. Within the interpretation where these are co-indexed, you copy Frank in and replace the pronoun at LF. So the first sentence in each pair is the spell out, what you hear. And the second sentence in each pair is the LF, or the meaningful representation. Now, in the LF copying hypothesis, we propose that the same kind of operation happens with VP ellipses. So imagine that just like there are anaphors and pronouns, there are equivalent structures that replace verb phrases, but they happen to be null. We've argued for lots of null things, so this should come as no surprise to you. So imagine there's a sort of proverb, like a pronoun, that functions like a pronoun and refers back to something else in the sentence. So this verb phrase here, this null verb phrase, because of its indexation, refers back to this. Then we can extend our copying process. So our copying process that replaces pronouns with the thing they are co-indexed with also happens here. So this null proverb gets replaced by eat an apple because it's co-indexed with eat an apple. And this gives us our recovered meaning. The meaning Frank will eat an apple and Morgan will eat an apple too. So that's the interpretation we have. So our surface form has the null pronoun and our LF has the copied verb phrase. So ellipsis, under this hypothesis, is a null proverb that's there in the syntax without any structure. It's completely null. And then its meaning gets resolved by copying, just the way pronouns and anaphors do. Now let's contrast this LF copying hypothesis with a different hypothesis. This is the hypothesis of deletion, and particularly deletion at Pf. So take a sentence like, Frank will eat an apple and Morgan will too. That's our surface form, that's what we hear, that's our Pf. But imagine if at spell out and at LF, this element has not in fact deleted. It's present all the way through the derivation. So the sentence, Frank will eat an apple and Morgan will eat an apple too, is essentially the structure of the sentence. It's just that at Pf, we hate to say things twice. So because we have already said eat an apple, we won't say it again. So we choose not to pronounce things that we have already said. And that also sort of happens under co-indexation. We know that this is a copy of what we had previously said, so we just leave it off. So we delete at Pf. So at spell out and LF, the two verb phrases are both there. It's just that the phonology, the phonological content is deleted at the Pf level. So let's contrast the two hypotheses. The LF copying hypothesis says there's no structure in the missing string before spell out, there's just an empty verb phrase. The Pf deletion hypothesis, by contrast, says there is structure in the missing material before LF and spell out. It's just you don't pronounce it. So these two hypotheses make different predictions. So it's actually an interesting theoretical exercise to compare them and try and figure out which one is right. Interestingly, there is evidence that both of them might be right. So let's run through evidence for each of these hypotheses and then come back to compare them. So first of all, let's talk about evidence for LF copying. Now this comes from a very complicated set of phenomena that have to do with the interpretation of pronouns or anaphors that are inside of elided verb phrases. So this is quite complicated, but hold on, once you sort of see the pattern, it becomes clear. So we're going to start with the sentence, Calvin will strike himself and Otto will too, where we have an elided verb phrase that is essentially equivalent to strike himself. Now what's sort of surprising about this sentence is it's ambiguous. So there's one interpretation, which we will call the strict interpretation, where the person Otto is hitting is Calvin. So Calvin will strike himself, and Otto will strike Calvin, effectively. So that's one interpretation of the sentence. There's also a second interpretation, which is where Calvin strikes Calvin, and Otto strikes Otto. So the meaning of the sentence is Calvin will strike Calvin, and Otto will strike Otto. Both those interpretations are possible. The second interpretation is called a sloppy interpretation. It's called sloppy because the anaphor in the embedded verb phrase does not have the same reference as the anaphor in the first verb phrase. In the sloppy interpretation, the interpretation of the anaphor is tied to Otto, not Calvin. In the strict interpretation, the anaphor always refers to Calvin. So the verb phrases are exact copies of each other. So under the Pf hypothesis, we actually predict that only the sloppy interpretation will be available. Because what we have is we have a clause underlyingly that is Calvin will strike himself and Otto will strike himself. And by the binding conditions, the first himself has to refer to Calvin and the second himself has to refer to Otto. because these anaphors find an antecedent within their clause. So under the Pf deletion hypothesis, the strict interpretation, where the second himself refers back to Calvin, is not predicted. The second himself would never, in fact, be bound by Calvin at any point in the derivation, so there would be no reason for us to allow an interpretation where Calvin is being hit by Otto. So that's the first problem. The issue is that the Pf deletion hypothesis predicts only sloppy readings, never strict readings. But the strict readings are available. However, and the other part of this argument is that we'll see that LF copying actually predicts that both of these interpretations will be possible. So the reason for this is that under the LF copying analysis, there are really two copying operations. There's a copying operation that replaces the anaphor with an antecedent. And there's a copying operation that replaces the null proverb with an antecedent. Because there are two operations, they could actually be ordered in two different ways. You could do the anaphor copying and then the verb phrase copying, or you could do the reverse. You could do the verb phrase copying followed by the anaphor copying. And by doing these things in two different orders, we actually give rise to two different interpretations, which precisely align with the strict and sloppy identities. So the LF copying hypothesis predicts the existence of these two interpretations. So let's run through these two derivations, and we'll see how we get the two different interpretations. So the first interpretation we want to derive is the strict interpretation. That's the interpretation where the himself always refers to Calvin, no matter what clause it appears in. And we get this order by doing anaphor copying before we do the verb phrase copying. So we have this string, Calvin will strike himself, and Otto blank 2. If we apply the anaphor copying rule first, what we're going to do is replace himself, because it is co-indexed with Calvin. We get Calvin will strike Calvin. Then the second thing we do is verb phrase copying. So now we have Calvin inside of this verb phrase, and when you copy it into the second verb phrase, we're going to copy Calvin with it. So this will get us the interpretation, Otto will strike Calvin. That's the strict interpretation where the anaphor always refers back to Calvin, no matter which clause it appears in. So we can derive the strict interpretation. Remember, the Pf deletion hypothesis could not get the strict interpretation. But we can also get the sloppy interpretation. All we do is reverse the order of the operations. So if what we do is we take Calvin will strike himself and Otto will too, and we first copy the verb phrase. So we're going to replace this null verb phrase with a copy of this verb phrase. So we get Calvin will strike himself and Otto will strike himself. Then we have two different operations of anaphor copying. So here, this anaphor himself is going to refer back to Calvin, and Calvin will get copied in here, and this anaphor will refer back to Otto, and Otto will get copied in. So this gives us a sloppy interpretation, where Calvin is hitting Calvin, and Otto is hitting Otto. These two different interpretations can only be derived if we have a theory of LF copying rather than Pf deletion. So LF copying makes the right predictions, Pf deletion makes the wrong predictions. Well, that's great. So maybe you're saying LF copying is the way to go. But there's also evidence that Pf deletion can be right in certain circumstances. That evidence comes from a slightly different kind of ellipsis. So instead of verb phrase ellipsis, if we look at TP ellipsis, we find that there's evidence for Pf deletion. And TP ellipsis is called sluicing. It's kind of a crazy name, but it refers to sluices in dams, letting stuff slide through. But what it amounts to for us is we delete a TP, but when we do this, it usually happens after a WH word. So Calvin will fire someone today, but I don't know who. Calvin will fire someone today, right? Or Calvin will fire today. What we have done is we have done an instance of WH movement, and then we allied the rest of the clause. So we do WH movement of something referring to someone, and then we get rid of the rest of this after the who. So this is sluicing, or TP ellipsis, because this is in the CP, and then everything else which is in the TP goes away. Now, here's an interesting phenomenon. English allows DPs that are within prepositional phrases to undergo WH movement. So you can say, you can in fact move the whole prepositional phrase. You can say, with whom did she speak? Where you take the whole prepositional phrase and move it up. But in standard spoken English, what you do is you strand the preposition downstairs and just move the DP that's within it. So it's with whom, and we take the who and we move it up, stranding the preposition. This is called preposition stranding. Now, when you take the preposition with it, when you move the preposition, it has a really funny name. It's called Pied Piping, because the Pied Piper of Hamelin played his flute, and all the children and all the rats followed him into the hole. Well, the idea is you move the WH word, and which is playing its flute, and it brings with it the preposition. So, with whom did she speak? It's called a pied piped sentence. Now, what we find in other languages is that preposition stranding is not allowed. Instead, you must do pied piping. So in Greek, for example, you cannot strand a preposition like me and move the WH word. You have to take both. You have to do pied piping and take the preposition and the WH word when you do WH movement. So that's the first observation about a difference between English and Greek. Now, where's this going to take us? It's going to make different predictions. The LF copying hypothesis and the PF copying hypothesis are going to make different predictions about what happens when you embed one of these structures into the second clause in a sluice, where you've done WH movement and then you delete the rest of the clause. So we're going to use this phenomenon, this difference between Greek and English. Greek requires pied piping and doesn't allow preposition stranding, to see if we can test whether what we're doing is Pf deletion or LF copying. So what happens, we've discovered, is that the constraints that hold in English sluices, and the constraint that holds in Greek sluices. So in English, you can strand a preposition, right? You can leave a preposition downstairs, and what happens in a sluice is that preposition can get deleted. So you can say, Peter was talking with someone, but I don't know who. And the with gets deleted along with the rest of the TP. But in Greek, that is not true. You cannot strand a preposition downstairs even in a sluice. You have to have pied piping. Now, LF copying does not predict this. Because LF copying predicts that you should be able, in a sentence like this, to simply be able to copy the main clause TP downstairs. And so you should be able to do that. The second thing it predicts is that you would effectively have a second preposition because you would be copying this TP downstairs, but you already have a preposition in the pied pipe structure. So this restriction that holds in Greek is not predicted under the LF copying hypothesis, because effectively there's no TP in the structure to contain the stranded preposition, right? This is a null element in the LF copying approach. Whereas in the Pf deletion approach, essentially you just have the same strings present right up until Pf, and this string in the ungrammatical sentence is what causes the sentence to be bad, because we have in fact stranded a preposition which is not permitted in Greek. So there seems to be evidence for Pf deletion in Greek, sluicing. So what do we take away from this? We have evidence from LF copying that gives us the strict and sloppy ambiguity. And we have evidence from WH movement and sluicing in favor of Pf deletion. So which of these is right? Well, you're now facing the conundrum of a working linguist. Often the data we have conflicts. We have data, one piece of data that says one thing, and another piece of data that says another thing. So that is a common phenomenon in science. Sometimes the answers are not clear. So what do we have to do? We have to find more data. So ask yourself, what kind of data would you look for in order to distinguish the two hypotheses? I'm not going to answer this question for you. It's still an open question in theoretical thinking on syntax right now. Lots of people are trying to understand these issues. If you want to read a book that sort of delves into this question, I recommend Jason Merchant's book, The Syntax of Silence, which addresses this particular controversy and tries to take a stand in one particular direction. I'll also note that it is possible that maybe we need both. So maybe we need LF copying when we're doing VP ellipsis, and maybe we need PF deletion when we're doing TP, when we're doing sluicing or TP deletion. That is also a possibility. And I would like you to think about what kinds of data you would need to find to prove that. All right, we will move on to another controversy in the next video.